Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak on the nomination of Professor Lisa Cook to serve as the governor of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, 2 weeks ago, Senate Democrats tried to cancel the vote that was scheduled on Professor Cook's nomination. In his floor remarks, the chairman of the Banking Committee stated that Senate Republicans have been, quote, AWOL in the fight against inflation for months, end quote. The irony of that, of course, is that it was Democrats who wanted to cancel the vote. Republicans were ready to vote. And not just on Professor Cook, mind you. We wanted to vote on the other Fed nominees as well. So I objected to canceling the vote because we were ready to vote and we wanted to vote. So the vote took place. Professor Cook's nomination failed that day on a procedural vote by a margin of 47 to 51. So then, immediately after that, I asked consent to vote on the two remaining Fed nominees that have been processed in the committee but haven't been voted on. Those would be Chairman Jerome Powell, who's been nominated to be chairman again, and Professor Philip Jefferson, who both could have been confirmed to the Fed that day, as they could have been confirmed months ago. But the Democrats objected to us having a vote a couple of weeks ago. It's really pretty amazing. So let me just be clear, for the record. The Democrats hold the majority. The Democrats control the schedule on the Senate floor, and our Democratic colleagues have tied up for months the nominations of multiple nominees, including two Fed nominees who have either unanimous or very nearly unanimous support. That is Jerome Powell and Philip Jefferson. So if confirming Fed nominees is so important to our Democratic colleagues in the fight against inflation, makes you wonder about this strategy of canceling votes and not holding votes when Republicans have been trying to confirm the nominees. But I have a theory, Mr. President, as to why this is. And I think it's because our Democratic colleagues know that Professor Cook is simply unqualified to serve as a governor of the Federal Reserve Board. And they don't want to leave her stranded as the final Fed nominee after all the other nominees get confirmed. So they're holding the nominations of Chairman Powell and Professor Jefferson hostage in order to push through their preferred candidate, their top priority. Now, I want to address a specific point that the chairman has made in the past, because he's made this several times. He has suggested that somehow Republicans oppose Professor Cook's nomination because she's a black woman. Let me just be as clear as I can. That is a very offensive charge to make. It's actually outrageous. It's also blatantly and demonstrably false. This Congress alone, a little over 1 year, banking Republicans have unanimously supported 8 black nominees, 6 of whom were women. Cecilia Rouse, the first black woman to serve as chair of the CEA, Nuria Fernandez, Alexia Latortu, Adrienne Todman, Alana McCargo, Ventress Gibson, the first black woman to serve as the director of the U.S. Mint. Republican Banking Committee members voted unanimously in favor of confirming each of those 6 black women. But we still hear this absurd and outrageous charge. Philip Jefferson, if our Democratic colleagues ever allow us to have a vote on him, will be the 4th black man to serve as a Fed governor. He was voted out of the committee 24 to 0. Now let me just be very clear. Banking Committee Republicans didn't support these nominees because of the color of their skin. That's not the criteria by which we evaluate candidates. We supported them because each of them was qualified for the roles to which they were nominated. Frankly, that ought to be the criteria for evaluating any nominee, if you ask me, including Professor Cook. So let me address some of the arguments you're likely to hear regarding Professor Cook's qualifications. First of all, my Democratic colleagues like to point to Professor Cook's extensive educational attainments as evidence of her qualifications. She was a Marshall Scholar. and a Truman Scholar. She was. She attended Spelman College, Oxford, and she earned a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. There's no question. These are impressive credentials. But they do not, by themselves, qualify her, or anyone else for that matter, to serve as the governor of the Fed, especially at a time when we need a Fed that is able and willing to tackle 40-year high inflation that's devastating American families every single day. Now, our Democratic colleagues have claimed that Professor Cook is, and I quote, a leading economist, end quote, with years of experience in monetary policy, banking, and financial crises. But those claims are simply untrue. First of all, 75% of Professor Cook's assignment at Michigan State, including her tenure, is in the International Relations Department. It's not even in economics. Second, her experience in monetary policy is literally non-existent. Not a single one of her publications concerns monetary economics. When asked to highlight for the Banking Committee her top works on monetary policy, she provided one, a book chapter on Nigerian bank reforms published 11 years ago. According to the White House, her main qualification on monetary policy is her service as a member of the Chicago Fed's Board of Directors. She joined the Chicago Fed's board 2 weeks before President Biden nominated her to serve as a Fed governor. Third, her experience handling financial crisis has basically been limited to writing a cursory overview of the Eurozone crisis during a brief stint working in the Obama White House and working in Africa over 20 years ago. Now, Mr. President, you don't need to be a trained economist to serve on the Fed board necessarily. But if you're going to serve on the Fed board, you do need to have some views on monetary policy. You'd think that would be especially the case for someone who's an economist. Given Professor Cook's glaring lack of experience in monetary policy, it's perhaps not surprising that Professor Cook has been unable to articulate any opinion at all on how the Fed should tackle inflation. Throughout the nomination process, she repeatedly refused to endorse the Fed decision to pull back its ultra-easy money policy. She also refused to suggest any alternative policy. And only on the actual day, while at her hearing, did she finally begrudgingly say that she agreed with the Fed's path right now as we're speaking. Professor Cook's answers to very basic questions about what the Fed should do to tame inflation, to paraphrase the late Justice Scalia, amount to nothing more than logical applesauce. Professor Cook has continued to insist that she would need to be confirmed to the Fed board before she can have a view on inflation, because in her words, quote, we don't have access to all the data that the Fed has, end quote. And she also said, and I quote, we don't have access to the deliberations at the time they're being made, end quote. Now, these statements are just bewildering for someone who's been nominated to address the most pressing inflationary threat in nearly 2 generations. And let's be clear, the Fed has no secret data, as Professor Cook seems to believe. In fact, monetary policy, including the recent 41% increase in the money supply, is extremely transparent. Anyone who wants to know has all the data available to him or herself. Just about every economist in the country right now has an opinion about inflation. Every other nominee to the Federal Reserve has an opinion about inflation, including what to do about it. And since we know very little about her views on inflation, my grave concern is that Professor Cook will serve as an inflation dove on the Fed at a time when American families continue to be ravaged by these price increases. But you don't have to take it from me. Bloomberg Economics expressed concern with Professor Cook's wishy-washy answers also, and they wrote, and I quote, asked if she would endorse the current rates trajectory, she did not provide a straight answer, but said she would look at data once the decision point arrives, end quote. Another quote from their analysis. When asked how she would get inflation under control, she answered, by eliminating the risk of financial crises, end quote. Mr. President, the American people deserve better than this. They deserve a serious nominee who understands monetary economics, has a firm grasp on how to combat inflation and restore stable prices, and will serve without a political agenda. So if Lisa Cook doesn't have any expertise in monetary policy, then why would Democrats want her on the Fed board? Well, that brings me to my second point. Professor Cook's history of extreme left-wing political advocacy and hostility to opposing viewpoints, which I think make her unfit to serve on the Fed. It's exceptionally important to keep politics out of monetary policy. But unfortunately, we have seen the encroachment of politics at the historically independent Federal Reserve. There are people on the left, including in the Biden administration, who openly advocate that the Fed use its supervisory powers to resolve complex political issues like what to do about global warming and social justice, even education policy. Mr. President, these are all very important issues, but they are wholly unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandates and expertise. Professor Cook's record indicates that she's likely to inject further political bias into the Fed's work at a time when we need the Fed to be focused on fighting inflation. In her statements or tweets or retweets, Professor Cook has supported race-based reparations, promoted conspiracies about Georgia voter laws, and sought to cancel those who disagree with her views. She specifically and publicly called for the firing of an economist and colleague who dared to tweet that he was opposed to the idea of defunding the Chicago police. The fact is, the Fed is already suffering from a credibility problem because of its involvement in politics and its departure from its statutorily prescribed role and its failure to keep inflation under control. I'm concerned that Professor Cook will further politicize an institution that really needs to get back to being apolitical. I urge my colleagues to vote against the nomination of Lisa Cook.